What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello, and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast with both eyes fixed firmly on leadership. I'm guest host James Thomas, and in each episode of the podcast, we're joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, and maybe one day even Jeremy Corbyn's interview prep team. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We discuss everything from business plans to tenancy fee bans, and of course the innovation and successes that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chair of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Richard Lee, Managing Director at Kelrick Properties. Richard and his wife Kelly set up Kelrick Properties in 2005, operating across Ashton-in-Makerfield in Lancashire, and continue to grow from strength to strength, now managing a significant portfolio of lets in the area. Welcome, Richard, to the Parliamentary Review podcast.
Hi there, James. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. Good to have you on board. I'm going to start just by catching up, really. What have you and the business been up to since you wrote your best practice article for the Parliamentary Review last year?
Well, we've been dealing with the tenant fee ban legislation that's just come through.
Right.
We've also been, we've been selling quite well. Houses have been selling pretty well. It's quite buoyant at the moment. And it's just been business as usual, really. Excellent.
Well, glad to hear things are progressing well. So, of course, you mentioned the tenant fee ban there. For our listeners, can you expand firstly a little, just very briefly on what that is, and then go into a little bit more detail on how that's affected business and how it might affect business?
Yeah, well, in June this year, there was some new legislation came in to force regarding the tenant fee ban. It was basically whereby landlords and letting agents are not permitted to charge tenants for the cost of setting up a tenancy, and most costs during a tenancy are not permitted either. So it was quite revolutionary, and that's just come in June. So it's had quite a major effect on our business and the lettings industry. It's been quite comprehensive, really.
Is that something that you think is going to get worse? Do you think you're over the worst of it, or is it something you can prepare for more? How have you seen it sort of impact the industry so far?
Well, it's not getting any worse now. Everything's sort of settled down now. But realistically, it was a lot of consultation came in with the government and various bodies such as Shelter and our governing body, National Association of Estate Agents, and ALA. And they did some consultation, and then they brought in this legislation. But I think realistically, it was a vote-winning exercise. It didn't really have the impact it had on tenants. There's a few knock-on effects, really. One of them being that rents have now risen as a result of the tenant fee ban. Across the board in our area, I would say on average they've risen by about £25 per month,
right.
And that's to cover the cost of the tenant fee ban. So it's like an unintended consequence, really.
Cool.
The government was advised that there'd be an issue with this, but they didn't really seem to take it on board. So, on average, the average tenant is costing them around about £300 a year extra. Now, in the past, they would have paid, say, an average of £200 to set up a tenancy and then move into the property. But now they're paying additional rent. That's fine if you're a short-term tenant that's going to be moving every year, every 6 months or a year. But if you're good long-term tenants, they're getting penalised now by this legislation.
Sure. No,
there is also... Yeah, sorry.
No, it's always important, I think, to hear from organisations like yours that see the ramifications of what can often be quite showy policies. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the other things regarding that was the deposit issues. The maximum deposit now being permitted to be held is 5 weeks. Historically, it was you could hold a larger deposit, maybe even 3 weeks, 3 months. So, for example, if you have a pet now, in the past we would have charged 1.5 months in a deposit that would be refundable at the end of the tenancy if there were no damages. But now, consequently, as a result of this deposit reduction, where only allowing you to have a deposit of 5 weeks. The max, what was it? We can't take a pet deposit now, so we have to charge a premium, and that's usually around about £20 a month. So the tenant's going to be paying extra $240 a year, and they're not going to get that back at the end of it. Whereas previously it was a deposit, they would have got it back at the end of the tenancy. So that's another unintended consequence, really.
Sure, no, I see what you mean. Where it seems like it's all positive, but actually it's affecting both parties quite negatively.
Yep.
Well, in terms of certainly, obviously, lots to sort of unpack in what's going on at the moment. But let's go back to sort of the origin story of the business. You've obviously proven concept at this point. You're 15 years in, but when you were setting up, it was 2005, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What did you think?
Such a long time ago.
Yeah, sure. It's a lifetime back. What did you think that you could do differently for the market? What made you confident in your approach to business?
Well, to be honest, we were quite green to business. If we'd have known now what we didn't know then, it would have been a different story. Obviously, but hindsight's a wonderful thing. But I think what we did differently, we took the business and we started with sales and lettings. Whereas at the time, those two disciplines were really split. There were sales agents and there were letting agents. But when we opened up, we had properties ourselves, and we wanted to predominantly do lettings, but also we started doing sales as well. So that really was something different, really, at the time.
Sure. No, it's always interesting to hear how people sort of start these things, because once you're in the position you are now, it's all seems so sort of official, but everyone has to pull it together at the beginning, and everyone has their own strategies. One of the most interesting things I saw was your reflections in your best practice article for the review, where you were talking about the 2008 recession, which will, of course, have come in just 3 years after you launched. But you wrote that this period made you stronger and more resilient, a very optimistic take on something that was obviously very challenging. Can you expand on your sort of thinking with that?
Right. Well, obviously, at the time, it doesn't feel like you're going to be strong and resilient. You just you're just panicking, really, because obviously things are tough. Income's not coming in because properties are not selling, and like for 1 month during that period, I don't think we sold a single property. So it's panic at the time, but you sort of cut costs in different areas like marketing. At the time, we didn't make any redundancies. We didn't lay off any staff, so it wasn't detrimental to any of the staff. They didn't really notice much of an issue, really, because it was business as usual for them. That's the front we put up there. But we were basically subsidising to stay afloat. But as I say, we did cut costs and we did things more efficiently, and we looked at other revenue streams and things like that that got us over it, really. And I think the reason that we survived that period was because we had a large lettings book that was giving us residual income all the time, and we were looking after landlords for their portfolios and things. But that was bringing in income as well, while the sales market was so dire and the properties weren't selling. Sure.
Well, it's nice to see that you can take something positive out of a sort of challenging period. And actually, it sounds like the general approach to business is a very positive one. I know you're very much of the ethos that a happy workforce is a productive one, and as such, do your best to support a sort of positive work culture. How do you do this, and what impact do you think that has on your staff and your business?
Well, we all our first and foremost, all our staff are on commissions, so they're driven to get targets, and obviously, if we sell a house for somebody, they get a commission for it. So that's good, because it means that we're getting the best price for our customers, and they're getting paid. Our staff are getting paid the commission for it as well. So everyone's a winner, really, in that respect. We also have sort of a work hard and play hard culture where we reward the staff for if they hit the targets. We do spot prizes and things. If say they've done something that's exceptional, maybe get a positive review or something like that, we would give them an on-the-spot prize, and they don't know what that is, and they're not expecting it. So that instills a bit of positivity throughout the business. Sure. We also occasionally go out for meals and things. Like take all the staff out for a meal at a restaurant or something.
No, I can imagine that makes a big difference, sort of creating that kind of network within the company. I think I read something in your articles as well about if they've been around for the company for 10 years or something like that. You sort of fleshed that one out.
Well, we've got a couple of members that have been staff that have been with us for over 10 years now, and on their 10th year anniversary, we bought them a watch, quite an expensive watch, but it's something that obviously we're happy with them staying with us for 10 years, so we want to reward that loyalty, and they're happy that they've received it, obviously, because they weren't expecting it. So, also another thing we do, we give them a day extra annual leave for 5 years service. So each year, after the 5 years, they get an extra day leave for up to 10 years. So it gives them an extra week on the normal annual leave.
That makes sense. Have you got anyone moving towards the year 20 within the company yet?
Not yet, no. I think 13 is the highest at the moment. All
right, so you've got a bit of time to plan the next presence.
Yeah.
Something I was quite intrigued by in your article, you hold property advice clinics on Wednesday afternoons, which, as I understand it, they're open to anyone. It's not just current customers. What's the sort of thought process behind this operation?
Well, that's obviously to give something back to the community. If people are looking at any kind of question, maybe they've got an awkward tenant that's giving them some trouble with the tenants or something, we can advise on that because we're the experts of tenancies. They may have some issue regarding selling the house and what they want to do to improve the sale of the house. So we can give them advice on that sort of thing. They just come off the street. They don't have to be our existing customer. They're brand new to us. And the idea really is to try and create a rapport with people and then maybe get business in the future.
Yeah, no, it makes sense as a plan, and it's something that you see more and more in today's society. I think people speaking about how there's a bit of a disconnect between the general public and businesses. So I personally believe, and it sounds like you do too, that creating these links with the community is a really strong step, both for the business and for making sure there's a bit more of a harmonious existence between the two. Now, sorry, go on.
Oh, and we wanted to try and portray the fact that we're experts in the industry as well, because we're members of the National Association of Estate Agents and ALA, and those bodies. We want to try and portray the fact that we're experts and show people that, and that's a way of giving out knowledge to customers as well.
Right. No, it sounds like a really good endeavour. Now, something I knew you wanted to speak about, and moving a bit onto the future, you were very keen to chat about the possible demise of Section 21 notices. For our listeners, could you explain a bit about what that actually is and what the impact would be?
Well, Section 21 notice is a notice that allows a landlord to evict a tenant without any reason. So if a landlord wanted to, I'm getting distracted there. If a landlord wanted to evict a tenant, they can use a Section 21 notice, and that gives them guaranteed possession of the property. So in the future, the political thoughts are that there have been consultations about sort of finishing this Section 21. They're calling it a no-fault eviction, and they think it's bad for the industry, so they're trying to abolish those Section 21 notices in the future. This will have a big effect on the industry because landlords then won't be able to evict quite so easily. They'll be able to still evict on the grounds of rent arrears and unsocial behaviour and that sort of thing. But it may be difficult for a landlord to get a property back if, for example, they want to sell it, or they might have other reasons that are personal to them as to why they want to evict a tenant and get that property back.
So I imagine it slows down sort of confidence in the industry. If people aren't thinking they're going to be able to get rid of tenants, why would you ever start letting the property out?
Exactly. Like so we're getting landlords now that are leaving, selling up and leaving prior to this anyway, and also due to the previous tenant fee ban. So the market is contracting a little bit, and I don't think the government has realised what the implications could be and how bad they could be, because if a lot of landlords leave the sector, then the available stock will diminish as well. So there'll be less properties available for the tenants to rent. So that's sort of the knock-on effect.
So sort of building on that, is there anything else we've covered? Obviously, Section 21 notices and tenancy fee bans as well. But is there anything else on the horizon, potentially politically, that excites you or worries you in relation to the business and the industry that should be sort of drawn attention to?
Well, we've got obviously the ongoing tax relief on buy-to-let mortgages. That's gradually coming in. I think we're on year 2 now, and over the next 5 years that will be reduced to 100%. So you don't get any tax relief on interest on mortgages.
Right.
So that's going to have implications on the profitability of a landlord's portfolio. If they've got borrowing, they can't use the interest part of the as part of the loss. So they're going to pay tax on that as if they made profit where they're not actually made profit. Another thing that's coming in as well, obviously, is exciting everybody, is Brexit. So I thought I'd mention that. But in the Northwest and in our particular area, it's not really had a massive effect. It's been going on for 3 years now, but we haven't seen any noticeable effect whatsoever of Brexit in our area in the property sector.
Right.
In fact, we're doing as well as we have done in the last 15 years since we've opened. In the last 3 years, we've been doing very well. So it's not had a noticeable effect at all. Whether it will in the future for us, I don't think it will. We do have immigration, no issues, but we've got people from Poland, Romania, that sort of thing in our area now. Whether that will reduce under Brexit, your guess is as good as mine, but I'd imagine it may do.
Sure. Well, my last question is a bit more of a tricky one. I'm putting you on the spot a bit. But what do you believe the most common misconception about your industry is at the moment?
I'm sorry, I've lost you there.
What do you think your most the sort of most common misconception about your industry is?
Common misconceptions, yes. Well, we do tend to get a bad press. I believe we're second only to politicians in how our perception is viewed in a bad way. But it's probably due to, I think they believe we're unscrupulous, but that's not. We're not all unscrupulous, especially now. There's a lot of regulation in the industry, and everything's pretty much transparent. If customers have issues with the service they've got the possibility to complain to us, and then on to the property ombudsman. So that sort of thing now it's very much improved. Services improved for the customers, and I think that popular misconception may well reduce slightly now.
Well, from speaking to you, Richard, I hope it does. It sounds like you're doing some really interesting work. That's all we've got time for today. But Richard, I'd like to say thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. It's always very interesting to hear from organisations like yourselves and to get a real insight into how you operate. So thanks for coming, and we'll speak again soon.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Richard Lee, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Kelrick Properties are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up is our usual host, Jonathan White's interview with the Parliamentary Review's co-chair, Lord Pickles. Lord Pickles was Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government under David Cameron before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the UK's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist, which is flags to you and me. I hope you all enjoy listening, and back to Jonathan.
Eric, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we we don't want to do that. So it's against everything. But there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Control Act will take place. So, as we speak, we don't quite know. As, well, perhaps like the government front bench, don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without wrecking amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40-odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December, something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, it's suddenly, oh no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition that claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments, they introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshireman, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament, because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership.
Well, I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
No, I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, and it's a way of not being beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner-city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia, and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around. My family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed. But, I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dynamo Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I'd Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Blunkett was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, for something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, the most normal thing would happen. after something like that would be the country would come together. And if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state. And it was on the basis of tough love. It was on the basis of getting people into jobs. It was about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old maids cycling to evensong and Warbane. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully. How would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit of stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
I think it very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working on with that, and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country? Well,
I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history of so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, and particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death counts. And we need to kind of understand the Anstaltgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy. The former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you were quite unscathed from it.
I can't. He was very nice about
Yes.
it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
That's, but it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time. But I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years. And it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle. Those have been left behind by our economic progress. And it would be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the newly refurbished Duke of York to stare into a glass of red while thinking about industry standards and how they've continued to be raised today. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.